Anything going on for you? Do you have any? What are you working on these days?
We're just finishing up converting one E module that was used for a convention to Osric and CNC, and we just last night published a guide to converting from one E to CNC because it turned out to be a lot more work than we expected, and people were asking for one, so we threw one together for GMs to use.
Oh, that's cool. I have some CNC stuff though. I've never actually played CNC itself. I've played Osric a couple of times. I mean, it's basically 1E, which is cool. Which module was it that you converted?
This is where I sound silly. Temple of the something of the Sun.
Okay, I guess yeah. So that wasn't an official module. That was just, or maybe it was. I don't know. That was something that was run a convention module.
Phil Sylvie, who does concept review for us, wrote it for a convention in 2004 and ran it a few times at different conventions.
Oh, okay. So it's not that old. I was thinking it was like an original 1E era module.
No, I kind of teased him about writing a 1E module in 2004.
But I guess, everything that's old is new again, which is great because I really like that old stuff. So it was interesting talking to somebody. They said they found it was easier to teach a new person 5th edition than something like Basic Expert or 1st edition, which kind of boggles my mind. But I can't undo all the years of ingrained knowledge I have of those systems to look at it as if I was a new person.
Yeah, I would think Basic would be easier, but I think there's more excitement about 5e, which makes it easier to teach people if they're really into it.
Yeah, I think the thing that they mentioned, which I guess makes sense, is the fact that it's essentially the unified D20 system versus the different subsystems have their own mechanics, right? So, oh, you're doing this, roll D20. Oh, you're doing that, roll 1D6. Oh, you're a thief, now you got to roll percentage dice. Whereas at least with 5th edition, there may be a lot of stuff you're rolling and all this, that, but the mechanic is unified. So once you understand that basic D20 plus mods versus some kind of difficulty rating, everything else makes a lot more, you could just kind of, then it's just about the context of different things. Whereas with, say, basic, you're a thief, suddenly you have these things in the percentages. Other classes, maybe it's 1 and 6 or whatever, 2 and 6. So I get that. I kind of like the flavor sometimes. I kind of wonder if it's ever going to swing the other way as far as the unified mechanics versus having different subsystems or submechanics. But part of me likes the flavor of having different things. But at the same time, yeah, it is easier to grok if you just have to learn essentially one die rolling kind of mechanic versus several.
And that is what CNC's strength is. It simplifies all the different like bend bars and lift gates and stuff like that under what they call the siege engine, which is their core ability check mechanic.
Right. Do you do a lot with CNC? Because we could basically call this the CNC episode if you want to dig into that. I have some of the books, but to be honest, I never dug too deeply into it.
So we got 15 5e modules and currently 5 CNC modules, and moving forward we have 10 more on the books plus the one that is split between CNC and Osric.
Nice. Why'd you pick Osric as your retro clone of choice?
That was Bill's preference, and one of the things we tried to do is maintain the flavor that he shot for with the module, because that's the feel is everything in 1E. So we tried to keep it as close in line with his thoughts as we could.
Yeah, it's hard to get much closer to 1E than Osric without just going to 1E itself. I felt like, at least, it's been a long time since I read it, but it seemed like it was not one of these retro clones that was trying to put in a bunch of house rules or do different things like how that author felt about it. It seemed like they were trying to stick really close to just giving you, as close to 1E as you can get without getting sued.
Yes. And the one interesting change that they made, and I wonder if it had something to do with being sued, but I haven't looked into it because we were crazy busy trying to get through this when it turned out to be more than we thought it would be, was treasure. Each monster has a list of, here's the possibilities for the percentage per type of coin and per gems and per magic item that you might have some in this horde rather than treasure types that you can index.
Yeah, the thing is, I found I was doing something where I was trying to look through that, and maybe it's just because it's been a while, but I actually found it a little bit confusing having to reference a whole bunch of different stuff. So I can definitely see how just saying, look, instead of doing this A, B, C, D, E, whatever, just doing something like that. Like I could see that being a little bit just easier. Sometimes you forget, like, what is E? Because what is A? What is B? Then you got to try to look those up. Then you got to roll dice on other tables as opposed to saying, hey, look, this is X, roll X for coins, roll X percent for this other thing. I get that. I feel like, so I guess what I'm saying is, I guess I could see it as a just sort of ease of use change, as well as maybe skirting around if there was any issues with referencing the exact same tables as 1E had.
In that regard, yeah, I guess it is easier because all the information you need for the monster is right there. You don't have to go to a set of tables in a different book because it was Monster Manual had the treasure tables, but the treasure was all in the DMG. So maybe that is it.
Right. And I think that was what it was. I think I was trying to look at, I had done a video a little bit while back on analyzing the succubus. And I think somebody pointed out like, hey, look at the treasure. And I was like, well, let me take a look at their treasure. And yeah, I had to, was like, and I hadn't been in those books for a little while. So I was like, okay, Monster Manual, here's the treasure table. Here's the treasure, listing, but there's nothing there. Okay. Now I got to remember which book. Is it the player's handbook? Is it the DMG that's got the rest of those tables? And ended up taking a lot longer than if they just said, here's some abbreviated list of each type and what the chances are of getting any particular thing.
The 1E treasure list wasn't real. The personal treasure list was really well organized with, copper, silver, gold moving left to right and down the chart. But the in-layer treasure was all over the place. I mean, you'd think treasure type A would be better than type I or worse, and that there would be a trend there. But there,
right. I think that's the other thing. Yeah, it's not exactly just linear. Okay, we're going to go lowest to highest or something of that. Yeah, it is kind of. I mean, I appreciate what they were trying to do, and you could get some really interesting combinations, and they played a lot with it. But I'm sure, going into it with a fresh eye after however many years, there were better ways to get you the same kind of variance and treasure percentages or whatever odds than the way they did it. But I do miss it. The 5th edition doesn't really have anything like that. I don't know. I don't even know if there's any guidance for what treasure you get from particular monsters or what they have, but I don't think there's anything in any of the books now that has that. I mean, I think maybe the DMG maybe has just random treasure, but not in any way that's customized for types of monsters.
It's been a while since I looked, but I think we did use tables from,
I think they have like a general table, but I don't think they have anything like orcs and those humanoids have this percentage chances of certain things, and dragons have this percentage. You know what I mean? Like something that's as in depth. Like I don't think if you look at a Monster Manual 5th edition entry, it gives you any kind of guidance onto what treasure they have. I might be wrong, but I think that's something they kind of jettisoned for whatever reason.
I think they based it more on the characters than they did on the monsters, which we can argue about that, whether that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Yeah, and with that, why don't you go ahead and give your intro, and if you have a particular link or several that you want to throw up in the chat when anybody decides to join in.
I'm Don from Hellebarde Games. We write modules for 5e and CNC, and soon we'll have a dual-stated module for CNC and Ozric. There are 4 of us regularly involved, and like everybody else in the industry, we have freelancers and help that gets things done. I'm pretty excited to be here. Again, always happy to join in and chat.
Appreciate it. And I'm Todd with Hex Press, and this is the RPG Breakfast Chats. We were talking about Osric because, as he just mentioned, they're working on modules for Osric and Castles and Crusades and 5th edition. And you always think of the interesting things, changes between editions, and we had mentioned that how treasure is done differently in the old days, where it was per monster, per type of monster, or breed of monster, and now in, I guess, modern game, when it's more about the character and sort of the character needs or the game needs, and kind of leaving it more to game master discretion. As you've just been going through and doing these things, what are the challenges that or the biggest challenge you've seen when you have been developing modules for both a classic or, in this case, a retro clone sort of classic game and the modern game? If anything you've run into that you didn't expect, any particular oddities in making the conversions that you weren't thinking would happen, or just in general, what kind of challenges that process has posed for you?
We thought it would be a relatively straightforward move because CNC and Osric both cleave pretty close to 1E, and we actually were surprised by the level of change. So I think the biggest one is unsurprisingly monsters, but the volume kind of surprised us. One of the interesting things is some of the monsters have name changes, and so do some of the magic items that aren't necessarily required. Were done for flavor purposes or because someone had a preference. So like in Osric, the Efreet is the Afreet, and if we hadn't had someone who played Osric to point that out to us, we may have found ourselves trying to recreate the Efreet, trying to figure out why in the world they didn't include it in the Osric core tone.
Yeah, I imagine that CNC is much more opinionated. I think it was maybe one of the first ones to sort of eschew just doing a straight up clone with saying, hey, we're going to take the stuff we like and build and really scaffold that out and go in some kind of, like I said, opinionated directions versus just flat out copying to make, just a copy of the original editions. Having, again, I've only read a little bit of CNC. I do own some of the material. What did you find were the kind of places where they diverged more than maybe you're expecting, or what aspects, I guess, of 1E do they really dive into versus where they go their own direction?
For most monsters, conversion is straightforward. Subtract the armor class from 20 and you'll get the 1E armor class. Subtract the 1E armor class from 20 and you'll get and you'll get the CNC armor class. For dragons, that's not true. They took this 2E approach to dragons and said, these are things that truly must be feared by armies. And so dragons, we had the module that we just converted had a old red dragon in it, and we had to drop it all the way down to young adult to make it playable so that it didn't just slaughter the party. The module's designed for 7th to 10th level characters, and to make it so that the party stood a chance against it if they fought the dragon, we had to drop it down pretty far. Some of the magic items have changes that make sense, but surprised us because they weren't 3E changes, and CNC kind of grew out of 3E's SRD. So there is no potion of healing, but there's potion of cure light wounds, cure moderate wounds, and cure serious wounds. I'm sorry, cure light, cure critical, and cure serious.
I definitely like the idea of dragons being tougher. I'll have to go back and look through second edition to see what kind of changes they made. But it's kind of nice. You know, I think that, I mean, there's those different things, right, which have been, I guess, an issue since the beginning. You put stats on stuff and suddenly people want to kill it. And I know that I remember reading about Gygax being just eternally annoyed at stories he would hear about players killing gods and whatnot. But, you know, as soon as you throw stats on something and put it in deities and demigods, you're going to have players and GMs wanting to put those things in play. And of course, the obvious kind of allure is to try to kill it. And now you get all the threads about how to kite a Tarrasque around a planet so you can kill it without taking damage, blah, blah, blah. So it's nice that they, you know, I think that some of these monsters could use a boost to be feared again. Going back to chainmail was something that, you know, dragons, unless you had specific heroes, were nigh unkillable. So it's kind of cool to go back in that direction a bit.
It is, and the only place it's really a problem. So CNC is one of our regular games. Most of the time we play CNC or 2E. We play 5E pretty regularly, and then we get weird 7C, Earth Dawn, that kind of thing. But the only time it's a problem is when you're converting a 1E module, because they use dragons as a mid-level challenge, and you really can't do that if you're going to CNC, but not the normal dragons anyway, not at the same age category at least.
Does CNC, and I'm trying to remember, so correct me here, the CNC emphasis is more, they lean into the kind of domain management or working your way towards domain management. Is that correct, or am I thinking of a different OSR game?
Domain management is not familiar, so I'm going to say no. I don't know why.
Okay, so do they concentrate really on making sure that you're out just on adventure? Like what do they? I always like the domain management thing, and I'm trying to remember which game. Maybe it's
Adventurer, Conqueror, King.
That might be what I'm thinking of as it gets into that. So what is, if you were going to put it? So, you know, obviously you have all the clones. You have the vanilla 1E. You were going to differentiate Castles and Crusades from all of those. What would you say would be the thing that it tries to either do differently or just emphasize that other ones maybe don't?
And all along since it first came out, we've always called it what 3E could have. They took armor class and it goes up, which honestly, if we're being honest, makes a lot more sense than going down when everything else goes up with the system. They standardized skills so that the idea of an ability check, which everybody used in 1E and 2E, was actually formalized and was worked to use for everything from ranger tracking ability to strength, bend, bar, lift, gates, pretty much everything across the board that's not combat. But they kept combat largely the same, and weapons do slightly different. Some weapons do slightly different damage, but that's because somebody at Troll Lord is a weapon lover, so they like doubled the number of weapons available compared to 1E. So that's why some of the damages are different, because they, made the charts for them look same. But otherwise, it largely, they have the same cure spells as 1E, and we actually have house rule that there's a cure spell at every level, but their core rules have the same ones: cure light, cure serious, cure critical. They have magic missile doesn't have the limitations that were placed on it in second level due to this fireball, or in second ed rather, due to this fireball. So it feels a lot like 1E, but it's got some of the new things that third ed brought to the table. It uses third ed style saves. It's somewhere in between third ed and first ed, because you can categorize them as, paralyzation, poison, death, magic really easy, and they actually do on the character sheet, but they're all ability based.
Yeah, I'm torn because I like the flavor in the original kind of saving throw titles, but I think from a practical point of view, having, reflex, fortitude, maybe were easier to quantify at a table in a given moment what made the most sense to roll against, as opposed to, is it poison or is it death? Like, those are kind of the same, but they're kind of different. How does that fit when you just say, oh, okay, this is a fortitude save like that? To me, it's just a little bit easier, even if it lacks some of the flavor of the kind of cool, save versus death ray.
Agreed. And one of the things I like about CNC is you can reference them either way. And so old school players and new school players get what you're talking about. basically you pick a stat and then you set a challenge level. So it's largely like third ed, but they automatically translate to the old save system. So you know if somebody says poison save that you're going to jump to con to make the save.
Yeah, it's cool. That is something that even in 5th edition has essentially that same exact mechanic. You're going to roll something against a difficulty rating. So it's nice to make it easy all around for however you're coming to the game. I really like the idea of having tons of weapons. One thing I always have thought about, I guess it's just maybe it's too much crunch, but I think it was in Chainmail, they had some table of different weapons versus different armors. And really, that thing that people will often on talk about or lament is that, oh, well, maces should be more effective against late mail, and this should be more effective or less effective against this other thing. And that table, it had that in there. So you could reference the table. And if you were wearing plate mail, but you were swinging with a mace, you had different numbers to hit and whatnot than if it was, a rapier versus chainmail or this or that. I always thought that was really cool, but I feel like my I don't know, my DM sense says that in actual use, it would be too fiddly. And unlike in chainmail, where basically, your armor class, you're using that was just kind of fixed. You don't have all the modifiers and everything going into it that you do in the game, that it becomes something that probably would take too long. But I always felt like, I'd love having just huge lists of weapons. I love always seeing those pictures of all the pole arms lined up against each other there that you can pick. Why pick, just pole arm when you could pick Swiss hammer or Lucerne hammer, or you could pick a glaive. So that stuff is great.
It really is. But, one of the things that we always get around to when we have that discussion is they're right. Those weapons would do different. I mean, rapier versus plate mail is going to be a hard fight. But the fact is that if you ask 19 out of 20 DMs at the time, and even today, they tell you, yeah, no, we didn't use that because it slowed down combat or because it made it more complex. And I'm okay with it not being there. I think it is a kind of cool flavor add-on, and we have used it in the long distance past. But the whole line of pole arms, we used to joke. I whip out my glaive, Muzarn, halberd.
I know that there was actually in one of the old Dragon magazines, I think there's an article by Gygax detailing some of the differences and some of the, just from, I guess, a historical weapons retrospective on all these different pole arms and why certain ones qualify as pole arms and a couple of other ones maybe don't qualify as pole arms. I mean, it's great. Yeah, it's that thing of like weapon speed from first edition. It seems really cool. I think you read about it, oh, weapon speed, this is amazing. So the guy with the knife, he's going to move faster than the guy with the spear and all this, that. But then, when you actually get to playing with it, I think some people did play, maybe some people are still playing with weapon speeds. It's just, you got to be really good at that, or things are just going to take a long time. And I think for the most part, when you look at the gains that you're getting in some of these, I don't know, quote unquote realism, whatnot scenarios, you so much other things, so much other resources just to track or the time it takes, the investment of time, maybe don't make them worth it. But I always kind of keep them in the back of my mind, right? Because I would love on something like Roll20, let's say, if you could throw all that stuff and get it behind the scenes just in the mechanics of how the game's doing it for you, so that stuff like your initiative, when you roll it, it just takes all that stuff into effect, and then or when you're hitting stuff, it takes all that stuff into effect. So you can play with all those interesting options, and then because Roll20 is handling all of it, it doesn't slow the game down to a crawl.
Yeah, true. And we actually kept weapon speed a lot longer than we kept. As a matter of fact, the last few years we've been using weapon speed in TUI. The problem we ran into it after a while was that if you use spell casting time and weapon speed together, you end up penalizing people using physical weapons because the numbers are worse. And so we ended up having them, and that seems to help.
Interesting. What's now? How do you guys just have it down to a science where it just takes mere seconds longer than normal to get everybody straightened out as to when they're attacking?
They just add it right to their init. They have it written down for a given weapon. They just add it right to their init.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, because I always thought, see, one of the things I guess I find all this cool is, and it always made me think of where, if you had all this stuff in play and using it, that as a fighter, you always think of fighters and you kind of joke as how many weapons they're carrying on them. But if you had all those things in account, it would kind of make sense, because if you could start off with you're facing an opponent and they've got a spear, and you know that the spear is slow, maybe you switch to something that's faster, thinking you can get in there and slice and dice and do that. Or you're up against somebody wearing a knife, so you pull out a knife because you're afraid they're going to get inside or do whatever. Or the reverse, where you feel like, no, I'm going to take the spear and I'm going to try to keep that guy 10 feet away where he's not even able to get a shot at me with that. So all those weapons you're carrying around suddenly have usages for. Or before, we're talking about effectiveness of weapons versus armor. The guy's coming in chainmail, maybe you use, or he's with a shield, maybe use an axe. The guy's coming in plate mail, you put the axe away, you pull out your mace, or or whatever. So I love that, all that flavor of that stuff. It's just I just haven't seen. I wish I could maybe watch you guys play or something, and see how a game can play with at least some of that stuff and actually get it to work and not be too clunky.
The nice thing about weapon versus armor is it gives you a response to the people who just take the biggest, baddest weapon they can find. I mean, we all know the guy who fighter number 1, 2, 3, and 4 that he ran all started with a two-handed sword. Between weapon speed and weapon versus armor, you can counter that quite a bit. The problem is that weapon versus armor terribly slows combat. Weapon speed's not so bad, so we adapted it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I love. I mean, and this is one of the things that's not necessarily anybody's fault, but you lose some of the stuff. Like, I know people talk about, spears and all that. And I think, like, polearms and spears should be really useful, but particularly in 5th edition, they don't give you a lot of out of the book mechanical reasons to choose them, other than if you decide to go, I know they're the polearm fighter builds and blah, 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 but there's a lot of advantages to having spears and polearms. If you use things like, well, you can attack from behind somebody else if you're using a weapon with reach, which suddenly means that, you can have a heavily armored fighter, maybe sword and board, in front of you, and then you've got a spear behind him, and you can just poke over the top with relative impunity. Like, all those kinds of things you can do. But if the game doesn't really do a good job at this point of communicating those to you, or even telling you that option really exists, then it just becomes, well, why would I ever use one? Or the other thing, which is people want to know, because it's in the books, it should be equal to everything else. Well, why isn't a whip as good as this? Or why isn't that? Well, because they're not as good. I mean, how many armies do we know were based on using whips? None.
There's probably pick the one I think everybody uses, though, didn't you? I've had so many people that go, we need to make a whip more effective. I'm like, why? It wasn't in real life.
Yeah, it's like, I know everyone wants to do Indiana Jones kind of thing, and with the guy with the, but yeah, it's just, there's a reason why spears and swords and those just kind of basic weapons were king. And yeah, the guy fighting with the trident and the net was an oddity. They were just there for fun. They were not there because it was a particularly great weapon in most situations.
Oh, hey, that's one place C&C diverged from 1E quite hard. And at first, it seems really weird, and after a while, it's just not that big a deal, is weapon versus size. They list creature size. The weapons don't care. The weapons do a damage, and it doesn't matter how big the creature is.
That's pretty cool. So what is the impact of that on different weapons? Or how does that impact, your choice of weapons? Do you carry around? I mean, is it something where you go, if we're fighting giants, this weapon is more effective, so we should carry, giant killers? Or, how does that work in the game?
The practical application is lower level stuff, to be honest. It used to be a two-handed sword versus an ogre, because an ogre just barely tipped into large would be 3 to 18 plus your strength bonus. And so, that made a two-handed sword even more appealing, even though you had to give up your shield. But the damage is the same for small, medium, and large in C&C, so there's less impetus to do that type of thing. I always wondered about that damage. They're larger creatures, so your sword does more damage. I mean, I would think that if you hit the leg of a human with a two-handed sword, you do a whole lot more damage than if you hit the leg of a giant. But I took it as part of the system and just ran with it. But C&C went, no, that's really not necessary. The sword does X damage, and it always does that damage.
Yeah, the only thing I can think about is, given that hit points are maybe abstract, maybe they're trying to say that it's a bigger target, you're less likely to miss. But instead of messing with all the hit numbers, we're just going to say it does more damage. We're going to leverage its effectiveness in that way. You just, if you're hitting the broadside of a barn, you're more likely to do something. But yeah, it seems weird, and that's probably something that I don't mind missing from the modern game, is some of those on this, because they don't make a ton of sense unless you're looking at it from a really specific perspective.
And they again introduce complexity that you just don't need.
Right. For what? And yeah, and it's one of those weird things. Well, like, how are they calculating the ogre's hit points indifferently because it has to deal with two-handed sword kind of thing? Yeah, it's it just adds more complexity kind of across the board for not a ton of gain, or any gain really, because yeah, even thinking about it, does it make sense that I would carry a two-handed sword around if I was going to fight something larger than me versus something smaller? Like, yeah, it's a weird decision space. It doesn't really have any kind of real world logic that you can apply to it, other than that's how the game works.
Yes, and there's a fair number of I won't say a fair number, but a very visible number of players that, if it grants a mechanical advantage, they'll jump for it, and that's fine. It's a play style, but if there are too many knobs to turn, like more damage versus different creatures, they tend to get into the weeds and not get into the spirit of the game as much.
Right, that's where they end up carrying like sacks full of weapons. We're about to fight an ogre. Let me go find the weapon that does a little bit better against ogres. Oh, we're gonna fight this. Let me grab that. I mean, that's one thing I kind of liked about way back when everything was just D6, is you could really just pick anything you wanted, and it was as effective as anything else. And so you didn't have to worry. You could kind of be freed about, hey, you know what? I want to make a fighter that uses whatever. I'm just gonna do that, and I'm not gonna feel like I'm missing something, or other people people aren't going to look at me funny because they're all the same. And I did appreciate that, though. Yeah, it's that we do lose some of that. Well, of course, weapon X isn't as effective as weapon Y, but just from creating fantastic characters, I liked it. It put everything on a level playing field.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Shazam!
One of the things that CNC did not do that I think 5e to a lesser extent 3E did a good job of was making your pure spellcasters feel a little bit more I don't know, heroic. Like they can survive a battle or two. I mean, we had a first ed wizard that would always be the last guy standing and would always be out of spells and have to whack the bad guys with his staff to finish, but he'd always win the fight. It was pretty funny. But those are unfortunate situations you don't want to happen almost every fight, and it was with him. And CNC kept the style of wizard that 1E had, and not terrible, but was one place they did cleave to 1E that I think future things that came out did a better job of.
Yeah, it really comes down to how you visualize wizards. I guess I'm still just in that. I just think of kind of Merlin and Gandalf and those kinds of wizards as opposed to the Harry Potter, I guess. I know it's probably not the first wizard to do that, but the kind of you're just firing magic out in a barrage, right? Because I get it. If you're playing a wizard, why do you want to be carrying around a staff or a crossbow or something like that? Don't you want to be casting spells? But I don't know. Something about those just like they're just launching pew, pew, pew kind of spell after spell after spell. It just doesn't fit the way I like to see wizards, but I have a hard time trying to come up with something else that they could do round to round, because I get the objection to that, which is that you have a wizard that doesn't necessarily feel flavor-wise like a wizard because they can only cast so many spells and then they're just like everybody else after that. I'd have to come up with something. I don't know whether I just give them more other slots or what I would do if I was really serious about sitting down trying to figure out an alternative to that. But I certainly see from people who love wizards, and if they're not in the sort of old school wizarding vision, and of course with more and more younger people playing, I'm sure that probably more people now, when they first think of wizards, think of Harry Potter and gangs than think of guys standing over old tomes spending minutes casting spells. So it's a different image, but I do kind of miss a little bit of the more, I don't know what I would call it, more deliberate wizard, but I don't know how to, I have no idea how to try to take that and make it fun for everybody, because definitely the old school wizard was kind of, you had to have a certain mindset and a certain kind of game had to appeal to you for that to be fun, particularly compared to the modern wizard.
Yeah, really, if you played a wizard a lot, you were betting that you would have a rough first few levels so that you could gain power starting around 5th level, which was true of the monk also. It was a character you invested in. You didn't, right away be the powerhouse.
Absolutely. Though you got some toys, like if you, depending on how you picked spells, if you ended up with sleep or charm person, those could be really handy. You could have some dumb monster charmed for months, for years.
Yeah.
So, it's just a different kind of power. But you're right. You're playing this long game, which I guess I think I kind of prefer that kind of balance versus the way everything has to be balanced now, moment to moment. But yeah, you were definitely playing a long game that, I'm going to be weak and you're going to be laughing at me and I'm going to be sitting back there with I think I used to get sling staffs because it was like, hey, it's my staff and it's a missile weapon all in one. And you're doing that kind of dance and you're trying to figure out which encounter today you can use your one spell. And hopefully you didn't roll randomly and your one spell is like comprehend languages or create food and water or something like that. And then, you're thinking like, if I can just survive, and then I'll start getting good stuff. But again, like, you did have these particular moments where you could really shine, as where you cast sleep and just bam, you've ended this encounter before it started. Or you do run into some kind of dumb, or not even necessarily dumb, but something that misses its save creature, they're charmed, and now you potentially have this minion that you're sending to do control for you while you sit back and cackle with glee.
Yeah, agreed. I think Fifth Ed did an okay job of that, because they took 0 level, made them slotless, and then gave you spells that could do some damage but weren't super powerful. I mean, they're pretty powerful, but they're not. So the effect is basically the same, right? You're not using a weapon, you're using magic, but it's doing basically the same thing, and I think that's okay. And then ritual casting gives you the ability to have that. There's a formal process to magic, and it takes a long time, and you must be learning to feel to the game too.
Right. I mean, mechanically, it's the same. And I get that argument, right? It's no different in a mechanical sense from a wizard just being able to cast offensive combat cantrips with them having a light crossbow or a sling and doing it that way. It's just a matter. It's just the image from, for me. I just have that just image of magic users, and maybe I just need to get over and get with the program of the modern fun and exciting wizard. They did nerf a lot of the other stuff, because now charm, it's not really mind control. It's more like, hey, they're your buddy, and it lasts for like a minute or 10 minutes or something. Sleep, I think, is also a lot less powerful than it was. So they did, I guess, what you gain from getting those cantrips that you can use. And I really, I mean, for me, it's not that I even dislike the idea of cantrips. I think maybe for me, it's something about having those combat cantrips, because I also like the fact that certain classes, and this, again, just it's the way that they now balance everything, is that everything has to be balanced in combat. And then I would have no problem giving them a boatload of cantrips that are maybe great outside of combat, but limiting some of the combat stuff. But again, that's just my peculiar point of view. I always think of, fighters should be kind of combat, should be their prime thing, and they should be the best at it, kind of across the board. And then wizards, if you're a full caster wizard, you should be the best spell caster. And then everything else should kind of float in between. If you have those poles of pure combat, pure magic, and then maybe one other one, say a bard or rogue is your pure kind of skill, talent, then everything else is somewhere in between and not as good as those. So I guess I always feel like when you give everybody just free combat stuff and make them all balanced that way, it kind of takes some of the shine off classes where I feel like that's supposed to be their specialty. But that's just my, I don't pretend that to be true. It's just what I'm thinking about it at the moment.
The whole utility thing, I personally like weird little utility spells that can help in the day-to-day, like mending. But I get that there are a lot of people who don't, and really the character abilities that they want are focused on combat, and they'll roleplay everything else or handwave everything. And I don't think it hurts anything to have them in the game, but again, it increases page count and complexity, and I get why they've cut down on that quite a bit. But I do think it takes a piece out of the game that is nice, because there's more to it than just swinging at the orc.
Absolutely. And you, I mean, even now you'll read about people who will talk about, hey, prestidigitation is kind of the sneaky best spell in the game because of all the different things you can manage with it. And yeah, if you situationally, stuff like mending is great. I just think the game, and it's interesting because as much as I think that the media around the modern game will talk about just how much it's into role playing and stuff like Critical Role and all these serious things, but everything really is balanced around combat, maybe more than it ever was before. I mean, maybe 4th edition was more, but I think probably 4th edition would maybe the most balanced around combat, but 5th edition I think is pretty close. And yeah, you just end up with all these abilities that are centered around what they can do in combat, relatively shorter shrift given to everything else. But it's like I can't say that it's not working for them, and it's not working for most of the people playing, so that's great. But yeah, I do miss a little bit where you could maybe justify in game that, hey, these guys aren't necessarily a combat specialist, right? Your rogues, they're not meant to get sneak attack every round. Like, they're gonna have to work to get sneak attack, but they have all this utility outside of combat that puts them front and center for a lot of other parts in the game when you're exploring. So yeah, maybe combat, they're not gonna be hitting their great thing every moment, but all that other time when you're sneaking around and they're the ones that are in front, running point, dealing with traps, all this is stuff, that's when they're shining.
Sneak attack is one of the hardest ones for me to adapt to in newer systems. I'm like, once they know you're there, it's not a sneak attack. Come on. You get one shot, and then once combat is going, they're looking for enemies. They're not going to stand there and let you stick a knife in their back.
That, and I think it was Labyrinth Lord where I played a thief, and it was really clear, and I don't remember Ostrich, I'm sure first edition is probably similar, but you had to be behind them, you had to have all this stuff kind of line up, and hey, guess what? If you're sneaking into a dungeon, most of the time the guards are generally facing you. If the guard's guarding a door, he's not doing it looking at the door. He's looking ahead. So even if you're sneaking and they don't see you, the idea of getting behind them is really hard. And I remember spending sessions and sessions and sessions, and I was just not getting sneak attack. And that was fine because I was doing I was doing yeoman's work in a lot of other areas. But yeah, it was not like it is now where people say, hey, the rogue, it's meant to, the way it's balanced, they're supposed to get sneak attack every turn. It's like, man, every turn, once a month, if I could get a sneak attack, I felt like I was, on top of my game.
Yeah, and it was a big deal too. Although the damage was never enough to warrant the small amount of times you got to use it. I'll agree with that. A 2 times multiplier at first level up to, I don't know, I think he gets to 4, maybe more in 1E, was not enough to warrant all the steps you had to take to get there.
Right. I mean, it's a trash removal, right? It's when you have those 0 level kind of minion types that are just kind of bouncing around, walking around, that you're able to kind of gut them like fish. But anything more formidable than those, yeah, you would hurt them, but not enough. And I could totally see, if I was going back to do something like that, amping up the damage quotient, just because, yeah, it is really tough to get. But now it's like you're not getting sneak attack every turn. It's like you're failing as a rogue. But again, that's just the way the game is balanced, and I get that. But part of me weeps a little bit inside for that. But I understand.
Interestingly, part of that is, so assassins get essentially sneak attack in 5th ed, right? One of the things I love about 5th ed is that we were playing and we had a 13th level bard wandering around the docks in the town, and an assassin that had been stalking her popped out of the shadows, got first attack, had poison. He almost killed her in 1 round before she even had a chance to respond to what he was doing. And I was like, this is what assassins should be like. they never have been in any version of the game.
Yeah, that's one of those interesting things, right? The whole, I mean, sneak attack is kind of like this too. These things that they put in the game because people want them and they fit, but do they fit the kind of game that 5th edition is really, or really any edition's really trying to do, which is kind of heroic swords and sorcery kind of fiction, which is not generally the assassinate a guy in one round or poison weapons. And they've always had a hard time trying to really integrate those aspects into the game, because I think part of it is because that's just really not the kind of fantasy that D&D, for lack of a better word, was sort of meant to simulate.
Agreed. Yeah, and to finish that story, because cutting it off there makes it sound bad. Once she got her initiative, she buried that poor assassin, because bards have decent spells, and she was slamming him with spells that would stun him and do damage, and then she was attacking him with her magic weapon, and so it ended up she won. But I felt really strongly like that felt like what an assassin should be. Stepped out of the shadows. He essentially shanked her really bad and almost killed her, and might have killed her had the dice rolls been just a little bit different. And then she just used her bardic skills to wipe him out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think from an NPC perspective, I don't really have a problem with it. I think it's more from the players, and that's that weird thing, right? I don't mind if as a GM you use the poison, or certain monsters or creatures or whatever use poisons, or you have kind of assassinate features, but it just makes the game weird from a player perspective, because either it's like, well, we should all be poisoning our weapons all the time because it's just better, and why wouldn't you, to just doing an end to run around everything if you just can have like this super assassinate kind of skill. But from like a challenge to players, I'm all over it. It's just, I just always felt like it was weird when the game tries to integrate those things, because they just don't fit very well for what kind of seems like the kind of player character fiction you're trying to create. Conan and a Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, all these different types, they weren't trying to poison people in one shot, even if it made the most sense, and even if morally they didn't care. It just wasn't the kind of thing they were doing. And I think that's the kind of game that D&D tries to run, even if it's now in the mode, or maybe always has been mode, of being the game for everybody, for everything. It has a hard time with those aspects because it just doesn't fit a lot of the other things that it's trying to make for the game.
Yeah, for my personal table, I have a no evil without prior approval for me, which pretty much eliminates the use of poison. Now, people have argued it shouldn't, but it does.
Yeah, well, then you get down to that kind of the relativism versus absolutism of things like good and evil, right? When, if ever, does torture and poison and everything become okay? I tend to look at it like when you have literal gods and pantheons and people who tell you poison is wrong, at that point, it's not about relativism. It's about, if you follow these gods and they say poison's wrong, it's wrong. It's not about when you're using it. That's just, you're under that particular edict, and that's that. But I do see a lot of arguments, particularly around, again, 5th edition, because I think they've minimized a lot of the impacts of pantheons and things like that. I mean, not that there was ever a ton, but what there was is even more watered down, that this idea has really taken hold. And maybe it's just the times we live in and everything, that if you're saving a ton of people by doing nasty things to a few, then that's still good, or that still should be allowed, versus not, which, yeah, from a certain perspective makes sense. It's just not one that I share in terms of fantasy, or like D&D style fantasy.
Yeah. I guess I'm going to violently agree with you, so I'll leave it at that.
It's different strokes, and that's kind of what I always liked about the alignment systems. It gave you, particularly back when it had teeth and it had things that had more impact, you could really have that stuff. But I also get it can be so capricious, and there's so many different, depending on what table you go to, people are going to look at different alignments differently. It's hard to know what's what. It doesn't really do anything now, so why would you really invest in it as a system when it has no bearing on the game today? I get all that, but those are the kind of things that I appreciate, because I just think as a storytelling device, as a character building device, there rarely do you run into heroes that have no codes or no limits or things they won't do. You always run into something where a hero just won't do that, and that's part of what makes those heroes interesting. I think it's much less interesting if they're just, well, I'll do what I need to do when I need to do it because it's convenient. It's boring, but I understand from a meta perspective who wants stuff that's just limiting what you can do. And when you take away the benefits, or you take away the carrots and sticks from that system, it just becomes more or less artificial limits. And from that perspective, I can see why people aren't necessarily keen to employ them anymore.
Yeah, but I get that. I lean toward, I like the requirements and the restrictions on paladins, and I'm not a terrible fan of every god has paladins, because they don't. Every god may have knights, but they're not all paladins. And that's a struggle I've had with newer editions. And I allow it because the system makes it very clear that there are no things like alignment restrictions, or they do have vows, and the vows are pretty cool. And I actually made some for my personal world that are the primary one we run in that are really tied to the deity. But in general, given my brothers, I would run with, no, all paladins are the good guys, and those guys may have knights, but they're just knights.
Yeah, I think the other thing is you had that carrot of paladins were A, really hard to qualify for, and B, they're more powerful than other classes. So you had a reason to take on this extra burden of alignment-based responsibility because you had more things you could do. Being able to just at will detect alignment and stuff was really strong. So you got that, but yeah, you had this other things that you had to do. When you start to take that stuff away, then, I get the argument of, well, why am I paying these extra prices for stuff that is no longer special? I don't get these things. I don't have perks that are above everybody else. I didn't roll better, so my stats aren't better than everybody else. So I'm not coming from that kind of advantage. So why are you giving me extra, responsibilities? It's that weird thing in 5th edition where you have some stuff that people forget or just kind of toss aside as flavor, which I think, and I don't know, I don't have any numbers to back this up, but I think, I wonder how many people who play paladins actually follow their oaths or really pay attention to their oaths game to game and really use those as a guiding principle for their character versus something they just rolled up at the beginning of the game and then promptly forgot. And then on the other hand, you have stuff like warlocks that mechanically have no real tie to their patrons other than flavor, and yet warlock patrons are kind of a favorite thing of DMs to pull into the game. So that bit of flavor gets mechanized and weaponized and used in game a lot, and the paladin flavor just, I feel like, and again, other people can tell me I'm wrong, and whatever it is that they don't get used a lot. It's kind of a strange thing, but because nothing has a real mechanical teeth to it, it's really up to the particular tables and GMs how much of it, if any, to engage with in the game.
Yeah, I agree. And I have always had fun with, you have strictures, you are a paladin, and that's not just paladins, that's everybody who has oaths, right? Even a cleric has requirements from their religion, and each religion is different, and it's always fun to pull that into the game to kind of differentiate the characters. I struggle more with warlocks. You voluntarily entered into a pact, and I know that there's been a movement to make, well, they're not all evil, but the ones listed in the player's handbook are a pretty nasty lot that you could have jumped into a pact with.
Right. They kind of do a funny dance, right? Because they mostly are either straight up evil or, just so weird as to be, they kind of Lovecraftian. If you look too closely at it, it'll just drive you insane. But then they also make mention of like, hey, this entity might not even know you're siphoning power from it, or whatnot. So they have all these kind of interesting things, but none of them, they don't give any of them any kind of mechanical oomph. But for some reason, it's really, I just am fascinated by the how the patrons have captured the imagination of GMs in ways that like deities and paladin oaths don't, because I see tons of stuff over Reddit and all over places about patrons and how they affect campaigns and everything else, and I see nothing about, well, my paladin's oath or this cleric's deity. I don't know. It's just the warlock in that particular sense is really just, it is, I guess I will say they give it a specific flavor that they don't to cleric deities. They just kind of say like, oh yeah, he's got a deity, move along, that they don't. But it's just interesting the way that's happened to work out.
It is amusing to me that people do have forever done well, I'm just a cleric of good and I don't actually worship a god, it's just goodness. But warlocks are the exact opposite. It's like, no, I got a pact with a greater evil and I'm loving it, right? It's kind of like, really?
Yeah, and my alignment is the polar opposite. I've got my patron's a chain devil. I'm lawful good. Like, oh, how is that supposed to work? But whatever.
I struggled with DMing for a paladin whose deity was lawful neutral, because the deity was all about trade and was like, doesn't matter as long as trade's not interrupted. And the player has always played the super shining knight type paladin and struggled hard with that. With, really, should I care that there's slaves on the trade road because it's trade? And I'm like, that's going to have to be up to you. And if there's any ramifications, I'll let you know. But
why did they choose that deity though? Was it just something that they just pick one out of a hat, or how did that work? Why did they pick one that was so different than what they wanted to play, moral wise, or morality wise?
So they have got the lawful good paladin down to a T, and everybody makes jokes about it that plays regularly with her. The idea was to try to stretch a little bit and to be the first paladin of this lawful neutral deity. It was an interesting game. We had some fun with it, but yeah, she had a lot more moral quandaries than the ones who follow a lawful good deity do, for sure.
Yeah, I think that stuff's fun though. I remember it was a sci-fi game, but the game was homebrew and it used D&D style alignments, and everybody was evil and neutral. And then I joined the game and I was like, I'm going to be good. I'm going to be chaotic good. And they said, like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah. because and it made for fun things. I wasn't somebody who's gonna, I'm just gonna go and now I gotta kill my party. Like we didn't. I mean, there was PvP in the game that almost never came up, but it was more about, the part of my fun was how can I get these people, because my idea was that they're much greater evils in the universe than these morons that I'm stuck with having to work with. So I got to figure out how I can cajole, threaten, just kind of maneuver them to do good, or at least help me defeat better evil. And then, if there was ever we've conquered the blast evil and you guys are still standing there, then I'll deal with you then. But that was part of, to me, I got a lot of fun out of that. And I find those moral quandaries are fun. If you can't do these certain things, but you still need to get something done, how do you try to do that? And, so I think those things are great. And I always appreciate having them. I guess that's why I miss where a lot of people argue for not having any of those kind of choices, or just, I can do what I want when I need to. I'm like, well, where's the fun in that? That's easy. Take your game off of easy mode, go to hard mode when you can't just do whatever you want when you want to, but you still need to get certain objectives done. Now think about how to accomplish them.
Yeah, agreed. That's part of the fun of the game, I think. But and some editions do a better job of catering to it, and some do worse. But at every table, you can make that call.
Absolutely. I really liked in the I don't know when they got rid of it. Was it third edition where you had alignments for magic weapons and things? And on some of the games I've run, I actually extend that to all magic items have sort of an alignment. And it's hilarious when you almost kill the guy that picks up a book because the book's a different alignment than they are. But it just adds I think a whole bunch of different flavor to those things when they sort of start to, it feels like the alignments are part of something, not just even with the deities, but there's just sort of, it feels like it's more embedded and grounded in the world when you can sort of demonstrate how alignments pervade everything, not just player meta to their character, but stuff in the world responds to alignments.
Yeah, agreed. I only do it for more powerful magic items, but yeah, I do much the same thing. And the other one, I pulled this from the first edition of Earthdawn. We do the magic item that grows with you and becomes, not more like you, but more in tune with you. It's kind of like attunement, but it's stretched over the life of the character. Your wooden staff, if you're a priest and you become super famous, will slowly get more powerful with you.
I haven't read Earthdawn, but I've always liked that. So how do you guys mechanize that in your game?
When I create a powerful magic item that I know stands a chance of being in the campaign, I will create it with different levels. So, essentially when the player is first level, it does these things. At fifth level, it does those things, or it adds these things in seventh. And then I'll have it all statted out and I'll drop it into one of the early modules. And so you'll think you're running around with a +1 sword, but as you go, it starts, dancing in your hand and wants you to let go of it or something like that. As you get more powerful, it tends to go with you so that you have a sword and it's named, and that's how famous swords come about, right? And so a little bit of your power goes into it, but at the same time, it gives you benefits back by being more powerful.
Nice. Do you use some variant on the ego and intelligence of items? Do they ever fight to control people or do that kind of thing that the classic magic swords had?
So the ones that grow up with you, no, because you guys are you're in sync with what, right? It's growing with you. But the ones that you just find along the way and somebody else might have done that with, but they're already a powerful weapon. Yes, very much we do. There's a sword in the world that his name is Krillian, and it is completely insane, and it has the spirit of magic user in it, but it hates all magic users. And so the first thing it does, if a lower level party picks it up, is takes control of the owner and tries to kill the party magic. A great sword, other than that, but you have to get it past that point to make it useful.
So if you overcome that initial challenge, does it then stop, or do you have to do that periodically? It's just going to try to slice a magic user's throat in close proximity.
So it's not. It gets more subtle and it gets more whiny. So instead of trying to just stick in the magic user, one time it picked up a rock and hovered it over a magic user, and the owner said, "Put that rock down," and it said, "Okay," and slammed the magic user into the rock and chucked the rock over a cliff.
Nice. It did stick to the letter of what was asked of it.
Then for your entire life, it will every once in a while go, all of this terrible stuff is because we have a magic user with us. How about I just kill him and we'll be done with this? And even if it's completely unrelated to the wizard. And so you have to put up with it making comments like that off and on all the time. But otherwise, it calms down and quits trying to do that.
I like that stuff. I really like magic items that are more wherever you get that more from, more than just a bonus, a plus whatever. I think so anything that gives things more character is great. But that's awesome. But I
All right. Shazam!
I see this now, which is kind of funny. I don't know how you feel about this. I would not like this as a player, but maybe this is the way I've played. I see these things where like a player will say, I really want a magic sword, whatever. I want a magic longsword +2. And then I see, I'll read on Reddit where the GM's trying to make this weapon. Basically, will find a spot to put the weapon so the character can get the weapon that the player wants. And that just bugs me. I would feel really weird if I said, oh man, I'd really like a Vorpal sword. And then the next session we open a chest and a Vorpal sword is sitting there. It would feel really cheap to me, but there seems to be this kind of transactional thing that happens now where players will go to the GM and saying, I want my Polar Master to have a +2 glaive guisarme. So can you give it to me? And then the GMs make it happen. It just really seems strange to me, but it seems like something that happens, or at least I read about it a lot, but it's not something that I would ever want to do. And I wouldn't want it as a player either, but maybe my head's just in a very different space than a lot of the players now.
Yeah, it does seem to be a growing trend. And I think, you go to a certain chest on a certain level and you pop it open and you get the pink scale armor or dragon scale armor in video games. And I don't know how much that plays into it because it's a little bit different than going to the DM and asking for it. But I think that there's some kind of relationship there that grew the desire for exactly what I want, because, early days and even very recently, you were grateful for what you got. And if you needed something else, you figured out a way to convert what you got into what you wanted.
Absolutely. I think part of it is, this is where I kind of go back to appreciating a lot of the simplicity in the OSR games, is the kind of hyper specialization that came about, I guess, starting in second ed and definitely in 3X. And that, you become a Polar Master, you invest half your class features, everything, and all your feats and all this stuff so that you're a Polar Master. Then, of course, finding a magic throwing axe, even if it's a badass magic throwing axe, tends to just deflate you because it's like, well, yeah, sure, I can use it, but my whole character is built around this one specific niche, and that doesn't fit. The other thing is I find is weird is I always felt like, and maybe it's just the games I played, that if I wanted something, say, okay, I want a +2 glaive guisarme, is I would start to try to figure out how in the fiction I can get there, like asking the GM, like, hey, has anybody heard about magic polearms? Are there any smiths that can make magic polearms, or any tombs for polearm fighters? Like, I would try to find it myself, be active in the fictional world to make that my desire of mine true, as opposed to going to the GM outside the game and saying on a meta level, hey, can you make this happen for me? So it's like, I guess there's just on those two lines, I just have a very different mindset that I guess a lot of people now, but it may very well be video games that have done that. Though in the video games, usually you don't get to choose. It's you find the weapon that you want, or the weapon you want, and you try to figure out where in the game you can get that weapon, which is more along the lines of what I'm thinking. But yeah, who knows? I don't know. But it is definitely an interesting thing. But I always felt like, yeah, either use what you get, and again, going back to say an old school fighter that doesn't care really what weapon they're using, you can use anything, then just use it until you get something you like better, or try to figure out in the game how you can go and actualize your desire for a particular weapon or armor or whatever.
Yeah, and I think in the case of weapons, right, that has always been a problem. The vast majority of magic weapons in most worlds were swords. And so if you wanted to be a specialist in any weapon other than a sword, you had to be really careful. And, good DMs will take that into account, and will have a list of places where you can find different weapons to use. Scimitars in the desert, maces in, this kingdom that grew up from farmers and evolved to them as the farmers fought, things like that. You can find places to put this stuff in so that you can go find them. But it takes work.
Yeah, it definitely takes work. And I definitely think as a GM, if you have a bunch of fighters or just characters in general who are diverse in their weapons or items, that you update your tables and you update things instead of saying, oh, there's only magic swords or 90% is magic swords. Because what I'll do is I'll usually separate the effects from the weapon. So you just don't have Vorpal swords, but any particular weapon could potentially be Vorpal or have these different things. So that opens it up too, once you update your tables, that if you do have a polearm fighter or an axe fighter or whatever, that at least they have a more or less equal opportunity of finding stuff. But that I feel like is a little bit different than them coming to me outside the game and saying, I need a +2 magic axe, get it for me, kind of thing. But it's a different mindset, different way to play the game. And maybe it's more in line with the, I don't know, more narrative focus. I don't know. I haven't really thought too deeply about where it comes from, but I see it a lot, and I always just kind of shake my head and shrug, because it's like, well, I don't understand it, but hey, as long as it's working at the table that's doing it, that's kind of all that matters. And what I think about it or what my preference is doesn't really have anything to do with it.
Way back at the beginning of the call, you talked about once you stat creatures, including deities, you get certain tables that want to go fight and kill them. And I think that's just the same type of thing, right? You have a need, you want it fulfilled, or you have a desire, you want it fulfilled, and that's just a different way to go about it. To be honest, when I first became a DM, it was because of the whole once you stat a creature. We went to Asmodeus's home, and I one-shot him, and I kind of went, no, this is not how this works, and I'm going to try running the game to make it different.
Oh yeah, totally. And of course, it's one of those things I think we forget is, a lot of us, I'm in my mid 40s. I started playing in the early 80s. I was like a preteen or young teen, and we did all kinds. I don't even remember the stuff, but I just can imagine how dumb and just kind of like my adult stuff would just be shaking his head at the kind of fun that we had doing stuff like, creating crazy Monty Hall characters and setting them up and going after Orcus and Asmodeus and whatever. But now we're older and we're looking at it with that kind of eye of play, but you still have people who are playing, and of course online you don't know how old people are, you don't know having no context for their stories, and they're getting their fun over doing the stuff that we enjoyed when we were younger and first getting involved. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm sure that these people who enjoy some of the stuff, some of them that'll just be the way they play forever, and other people, it'll change and taste will mature, or at least they'll all of a sudden want different fun, and then they'll enjoy different fun, but there's room for everything at the table, which is great.
Absolutely. That's kind of part of the fun. Some of the people that have played with me are off running some pretty wild campaigns compared to what I would run, but they're having a blast. And they started at my table with learning basically how to play, and are off running. One has everything is a skill, and every skill degrades as time goes on, homebrew system that he wrote. And one's running 5e where humans don't exist, and everything is a different species, and everyone has inborn magic on top of whatever your class is. And so and that's cool. They're having fun, and they had fun at my table. They're having fun doing their own thing now. I think that's great. I mean, that's kind of the point of the game.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Is definitely, it's what's fun for you is what's working. I always try to. I think when I see stuff online, a lot of times my response is just make sure that it is the fun. Because I think that one thing, and this is not a particular edition thing or age thing, but there are certain. I think you learn this as you GM a lot. I think you start out, you want to please everybody, you want to make sure everyone's having a good time, so you tend to want to throw stuff at them, give them what they want, all this stuff. But then often that's not really the way to long-term gaming happiness, because you really don't just want to give everybody what they want to do that. And I feel like that's really you want people to have a good journey to get stuff. You want them to feel proud when they accomplish things. And I feel like regardless of the kind of game you're playing, like that's really the kind of advice I feel like I try to lean on to now, is just, everything is fun, and however you're playing is fun. Just make sure that you don't, I guess there's like a carny kind of wrestling term they use, hot shotting, that you're not where you're just throwing so much they want because you want them to have fun up front that it ends up burning out what you're trying to do, because after a while there's nothing left. You've already handed out all the fun. You've already given everybody everything they wanted, and so the game just sort of stalls.
Yeah. You don't want it all to be about each individual combat and have each person trying to maximize how much damage they can do in combat. And you also don't want it to be the old school term is Monty Hall, where they get just loads and loads of the treasure that they want all the time, because that is also boring. And so I like to tell people it's the journey, or in the case of the game, the story, as much as it is your character. And
because one killed Asmodeus, who's left to kill? It just
exactly.
Nothing else is going to be fun.
This campaign is done. Eventually, the guy who was running that game sold me all of his books because he wasn't running games anymore, and I suspect it's because of stuff like that.
Yeah, it burns you out. I remember seeing somebody, and they were trying to, like, their heart was in the right place. They wanted to make every combat meaningful, but they were tying themselves to knots because they had to, like, every encounter area had to just be crazy, insane, with all kinds of moving parts and all kinds of weird machinations, because he felt like he had to up the ante with every combat. So no combat could just be kind of in a mundane space. It had to be conveyor belts and things doing, and teleportation stuff. And I'm like, man, that's great, and that's cool with your big. You want to have a big tentpole kind of encounter, but if you're trying to do this for every encounter, you're going to burn yourself out. You're going to burn the party out. Like it's not even fun, because you just you sometimes you just want to have something just plain and low key, and it just becomes too intense for everyone all the time.
Yeah, and you don't really. To steal a set of terms from 7C, you don't really need that with every minion fight, right? There are cases where you want just to have the fight and be done with it, get the information or whatever it is you were after that caused the fight to happen, and move along. And there are cases of wandering monsters where, I know Fifth doesn't like wandering monsters, but the same type of thing, right? A set external encounter where it's just like wolves or an owl there or something, where you're not going to have all this fancy stuff, and you shouldn't have. And so I agree. Yeah, you could burn yourself out really quick trying to do that. You certainly aren't using any published modules, or the vast majority of published modules, even in Fifth, if you're doing that type of thing.
Yeah, totally. And even as a player, like I remember getting really frustrated with some campaigns where every combat was this just life or death epic struggle. And it takes away from how you can shine because you never feel like you get to apply yourself towards things like that. I always like that where you could in a game, I think I remember Final Fantasy VII being one of these, you start off and you're going through the beginner areas and everything is just brutally hard. And then you level up and you power up and you come back and it's like, it's fun to kind of go through some of those encounters that now they're easy. Now you're barely taxing yourself because you've grown and now you're strong. And now these guys that were tough for you at level 1 are not really tough anymore. And maybe they even run away from you at first glance because they just know that you're just too strong for them. And if everything is this kind of epic titanic struggle, you never get that balance of like, hey man, I want to have like an easy encounter. I want to flex my muscles a little bit without having to strain my tactical thinking to their limits. And you don't get that. And I think you need that kind of balance. You need to have those things that are really tough and then things that maybe are easy, because it's nice to have those things. It's fun to be able to just be like, hey, I'm going to try something new because it's not life or death. I know I can handle these minions in my sleep. So let me try a different tactic, or let's have some fun with this, or, let's bully them and just get them to do our bidding instead because they know that they can't stand up to us, that sort of thing. You need that variety, I feel like, for sure.
Agreed. And I think the bulk of them need to be less, if you constantly have the stress of this is an epic battle, well, then none of them are epic after a while because people try to adapt to that.
Yeah, it just becomes stressful. Like I played in a campaign, I enjoyed it. I played in a game, but it was like we knew like every session was basically like 2 combats with maybe some kind of non-combat in between, and both those combats were going to be really, really hard. And yeah, there's fun in all those tactical decisions, but it's kind of like it just starts to start melting your brain, and you do kind of get less. It loses some of the, or at least to me, it lost some of the fun because I no longer felt that I had the liberty to try things that weren't bankable, because if I tried something and it didn't work, now I've put myself and the team kind of in a hole, as opposed to I felt like, oh, I have some freedom to kind of try some different things, because if I fail, it's not the end of the world. Now it's like, if I fail this, it could kind of be the end of the world. So I don't want to do anything that's going to fail. And I don't think that's the kind of space as a player you want to be in.
Yeah, agreed. That makes it less fun. And also, when you're doing that kind of thing, like what you just described, where there's longer combats and such, there's less time for role play if you're fighting those long.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right. Shazam!
It's kind of cool to hear about CNC because, again, it's one of those systems I've seen. I own some stuff, but I haven't really delved into it too much. From CNC to 5th edition, just to cycle back to that a little bit, there's anything you find when you're working on these things from CNC to 5th? There's anything from 5th that you would wish or that you would pull into your house rules for CNC, or is there anything from CNC that you would pull into your 5th edition house rules?
I think for the most part, they're covered. Advantage is an interesting mechanic. I think 5th relies on it too much, but I think there are cases in CNC where you could use it. And CNC has fate points, but 5th has fate points are basically points you can use to do super heroic things, and they're an optional role in CNC, but we use them pretty heavily. And 5th has similar mechanisms if you want to use them, so I think that's pretty much covered. The differentiation of classes, I think, is the attempt to make every class balanced in 3rd and later. In some ways, hurts the game. I'd like to see more differentiation in what they do in 5th. But, we play both largely because we get a little bit of something out of each of them. So I guess I'd say generally no, but, some special cases, I use advantage in CNC and it doesn't have that mechanic at all.
Yeah, I think advantage is one of the things I see people porting out of 5th edition the most, and it is really handy. I wish there were ways to, I guess, give a little bit more granularity, which I know is kind of the point of advantage, is to do away with that granularity, but I miss if there was some kind of midpoint where it wasn't just +5, -5, or 0, because I think what hurts, at least for me, again, this is in my mind, and I maybe this doesn't hold true for the most part, but I know that you could go too far with trying to leverage every single advantage you can get. But I think what advantage does is that I don't like is that you tend to now stop after you've granted yourself advantage, because you don't need to go any further. And what that means for certain classes who can grant themselves advantage, I think of rogues, and sometimes you get abilities where you can do stuff on your own to give yourself advantage, which then procs sneak attack. You don't have to work with the party as much because you're just able to do everything yourself. If I'm able to get advantage myself and then utilize advantage myself, then I no longer need to try to work with the rest of the party. I can just do a little loop of get advantage, use advantage, get advantage, use advantage. Whereas before, if it was, okay, I'm going to get +2 from this, and then, if I do that, I get +2. I think with those more discrete modifiers, you tended to want to get as many of them as you could. And if you were optimizing, you'd want to get all of them. That at least that led to more synergies with the party, I think, than what happened now. And I'd like the fact that maybe it's not just, you get one disadvantage. It might kill advantage, even if you would have had advantage from 8 different places, this one source of disadvantage just wipes all of that out, or vice versa. Maybe there's some middle road down the way, but for a lot of stuff, yeah, I think advantage worked great, and I like it a lot.
Well, and I would argue, and it would be an argument, that they use advantage and disadvantage too much in 5e. And so I use it very sparingly for CNC. I slip it in places where there's a big reason to have it, and don't use it most of the time. Most of the time, CNC's prime system covers giving you the equivalent of advantage. I mean, if you can get +6 to a roll, that's huge. So, having the right primes can give you advantage in things consistent. You always have advantage for the stats that you chose prime for.
Absolutely. The other thing with advantage is just so easy. It's easy to explain. It's easy to see. You don't have to even do the plus whatever or minus whatever math. It's just either you pick the high die, you pick the low die. It's just really easy to just put out there and very easy for people to get. So it was really a great way of using, knowing if you're, just thinking about, okay, mechanically we know it's like +5, -5 basically, but doing it in a way that at the table you don't need to know any of that. You just roll 2 dice, pick either the higher or the lower one.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Shazam!
As far as the worlds you do you usually stick in one homebrew kind of world? Do you make different worlds for different campaigns? What's your world building that you prefer? For myself, I've always felt like I've wanted to do the whole keep one world and just put all my game in it, but it never really works out that way, though. Maybe that would be my goal. I think if I ever get my act together and I try to put a setting together to use myself and then to publish, I would do that. But I always end up wanting to hit new things with different games that I run, so I end up wanting to create new worlds. But I'm always fascinated by the people who've been able to concentrate their world building into one campaign space and just use it. It just seems like you get really kind of a real richness out of that you don't get by jumping worlds every time you do new campaigns, but I can't seem to get myself to do that yet.
So I have one primary that is, and will probably give away some of my age, is 30 years old, a little over. And then 2 others that are, one is, I like to call it a development world. If we want to try something completely wild and new, we jump into that world for a campaign. And one that is, I think the best way to put it is a connective world where you can, if we know that we're going to go to a system that has guns in it or something, we can play in that world, and it makes it a lot easier to jump in. I think of it like GURP, right? Where it's a central world where you can jump off to places with different technology levels.
Numenera, I guess, is like that too.
I'm going to go ahead and say that Numenera is just weird.
I've only read a little bit about it, but I'm only thinking of, like, I think the concept, something like that, you can move around through all kinds of different tech levels and things in there. Okay, so Masked in Danger asks, for making worlds, how do you stop players making your homebrew setting into a kitchen sink? A lot of players feel that if an option is available, they should be able to use it, especially in 5e where new subclasses are appearing. So you've got a 30-year-old world. So I don't know if you use the same, you're with the same group all the time, or if you get a lot of new players and new infusion of players in your group. So what do you do? How do you handle it when you're looking at it? You have a set. Is your world kind of a kitchen sink where everything kind of is in there? What do you do when suddenly, let's say if you're playing the 5th edition version and a race becomes playable that players want? How do you deal with that, I guess, in general?
So the first part, we purposely go out and get new players every once in a while because we don't want it to become, there's this old group of grognards that nobody can join. So we make it a point, we'll play in a game store and let anybody that wants to join in so that they can see us play and see the world in action and stuff. And then we bring some of them into our home game. And that's a pretty regular process. Every, I would say, year or so, we recruit new players. And, people fall off. It happens. Life is not simple and doesn't always leave room for D&D. So people will drop out and then we'll go recruit new ones. And we purposely go for people who've never played with us. So there's a good mix. Some of our groups are all people who've been around forever. And some of our groups are 50-50. And one of the things I've stuck with is, yes, those are the rules. And yes, that is Unearthed Arcana. But yes, this is my world. And what's in it is up to me. I had a player who was adamant that there were no gnomes in the world. She wanted all the gnomes killed off, and I'm like, this is not going to happen in this world because I haven't been. And this started an entire joke because someone told her that gnomes were who picked the grapes for the world's most famous wine, and she started screeching that the character, not the player, started screeching that there were no gnomes in the vineyard. So that's kind of become a funny joke among players.
I guess they didn't leave the game immediately because there were gnomes in the world. So were you obviously they took it in stride that that there were just going to be limits to this world, or it's not, or the world is different than what they wanted, but they were okay with that, I guess.
Probably a better one to discuss because it's more mainstream is I very much control Dragonborn in my world. They exist, but they're a very small group of people and they're very special people. And so players who want to play one, I want to sit and talk with before I let them play it. And everybody's handled that pretty well. I mean, I've told people no, that their character concept didn't fit with how Dragonborn fit in the world. And as long as I'm clear and what I say makes sense to them, players are really okay with it. I've only ever had one person upset with my, you can't do that. And that's because he essentially wanted to be an acolyte of the god of death and kill the party at night. And I'm like, that's not going to happen. I don't PvP that's going to end up with you dead, some of them dead, and then what are we going to do?
Right. Yeah, I don't think I've had a problem on my end. I think what I tend to do is, I mean, it's interesting because I think there are lots of different ways that people get tables together. I don't know, again, maybe because I'm just an old school guy. I tend to be very much on the GM who's running the game, kind of creates the world, and then you either buy into it as a player or not. But if you buy into it, then you just roll with what they're doing. So one time I played in the game and it was all dwarves, and we were all dwarves. And that was just part of I guess the pitch of the game is, hey, you guys are all going to play dwarves. Is that cool? And I was open for it. Yeah, sure, that's cool. If we were, whatever. I feel like once you kind of, you make your pitch or you're kind of transparent about how your world is, I don't feel the need if I'm a player to try to argue for one thing or another. I'll find something in the game to play. As far as the worlds that I make, I'll try to give you a pitch as to what the world is. Like I actually kind of like a lot of my games tend to run towards, I'll just have humans, only humans. I think the last OSR game campaign world that I made, basically all the players were humans. If they wanted to play different races, it was just kind of, I was using Lamentations of Flame Princess just as the rule set. So, they have core, dwarf, elf, races class from BX kind of thing going on. I just told them that, hey, if you want to play, if you like the abilities that a dwarf has, you'll just be a human, but you'll have the dwarf abilities and you'll follow the dwarf races class, XP charts and everything, but you're just not going to be a dwarf. You will just be a human. You'll just have those kind of special abilities. So that's how I dealt with it in that part. In 5th edition, I'm not running a game in 5th edition right now. I'm not sure what I would do. I don't think I would I'm definitely someone who feels like that your game, your table, your campaign, the books are there to be sources for you, but you're not required. So you're not required. I don't feel like in any way every game is required to have all the PHB races or all the extended races or all of anything. You want to have more and homebrew your own stuff, and great. You want to have less and work with a subset of that stuff, also great. I think as a player, you make a choice. Hey, I'm playing in this game, and then the GM says, okay, or I want to play in your game. The GM says, great, here's my game. There are no elves, there are no dwarves, but there's Dragonborn, and there's all kinds of other dragon type creatures because that's kind of my game. Then you either say, great, I still want to play, and I'll come up with a character or concept, or I don't like it, I'm not going to play. I don't feel like at that point I should start arguing over why the GM of this dragon-centric game should allow elves or dwarves. Like, I just feel like either I might say, hey, well, like I did, hey, can I play a Dragonborn type, but they just have the kind of elf stats and stuff instead? Is that cool? Or I just think that game's not for me. I don't get into I should try to argue and change people's mind over it. I guess it's just not where I come from as far as how I think of the game and how it's run, or how I've, historically how I've seen it. But again, that's just me.
That middle world that I was talking about, the one where we do new wild and different stuff, that's if people want to do something that doesn't fit in the primary world, I'll tell them, we're going to start a campaign in X amount of time in that world, and let's talk about it then. And I allow a whole lot more in that world than I do. It started when Third Ed started to get an insane number of playable races. That's where it started. Where that world started was people wanted to do different things. And I thought, what the heck? We'll give them a place to do it. It doesn't bother me any as long as it's not completely undermining the system of the world that's already been built up. That's where that one came from. The third one came largely because we liked to play Twilight 2000 and Aces and Eights, stuff like that, and we wanted a place where the characters could go back to a central home and still move out to different systems, essentially.
I have very fond memories of Twilight 2000. I think one thing might be too that I see something now that at least I don't do, and I don't remember really having this thing, but seems to be a thing now, is players really carrying their character concepts with them, either between from table to table or coming to a table. I don't remember ever doing that. I certainly don't do that now. If I were to join a new game, I would kind of get the game and kind of get the idea of what the game's about and what the campaign's about, and then just kind of come up with a character or figure out what stats or roll for stats, whoever they're generating stats, and then see what fits and go with that. But I think a lot of people now, they bring their concepts with them to the game they're going, so that if you have a concept and it's a Dragonborn, and then you go to a table and they're like, yeah, we don't play with Dragonborn, but this is your heart's desire to play, I see where it becomes a lot more difficult as the player to live with the concept of not having that Dragonborn than it is for me, where I don't care and I'll just play whatever there is. I'll find something to play. It's just a different way of coming at your characters. And maybe it's just because people are just so much more character driven now than, before, where you're just rolling random stats and you pick a dwarf because you would be unplayable in any other race. So you go, okay, I'm not capable of doing anything, so I'll be a dwarf. And then then if that dwarf survives for a while, you get attached to them, and then they kind of become a character. But they start off as more, what do I think I can get that's survivable, and then go from there. So there's just different approaches to playing.
Yeah, and I see more of that with role or class than I do with race. We've got a player that it doesn't matter what system it is, they're going to figure out how to be a gun, and they're proud of it. I mean, they'll tell you, I'm the gun buddy. And it doesn't. The characters are they're not interchangeable. I mean, they have different personalities, but it always revolves around missile weapons of some kind. And CNC, with the release of the Adventurer's Backpack, released an archer class. Oh my goodness, you would think this guy had been given his best birthday present ever. And he's like, "When are we playing again? I want to start a new campaign."
Yeah, that's awesome. I can appreciate that. It just, some guys, they know what they want to play and they want to do it. I know guys that all they play were fighter mage thieves back in the day. That was it, and they were going to figure out. I mean, at that point, it was not. They would just, that was what they were going to do every time. I mean, I think there's something cool about trying to figure out how some of these different, how you can get the kind of feel you want from the options you have available. I think it's just for them, they're coming at it from, I'm going to take what I have and MacGyver it into a Gundam, and there's the other kind of player that's like, no, I want this sort of Gundam that's already out of the box, and I'm going to be upset if that particular thing isn't there for me. So it's just it's coming at the game from different ideas. But I've always felt, my always thing is, to me, I think with players, and sometimes when I talk about to them or about it now, is just be open-minded to the campaign world. If you have a character concept you're dying to play, that's fine, but just keep it in perspective of, think of what the campaign may offer to you, what this world may offer to you, before you jump on the give me what I want, because you might find enjoyment in something different if you give it a chance, as opposed to just thinking that you just have to have this thing that you want. Be open-minded. See what this campaign, this guy who sat there, this person has sat there and made a world and done all this stuff and put all this work into this to actualize this concept of a world in a campaign. Why don't you give it a chance? See if there's some value to it. See if there's some validity to it before you demand that certain race, class, whatever combo needs to be there for your particular happiness.
My unpopular opinion, that's even true of railroads. I played, and I probably had this conversation before, but I played in a Rollmaster game where we had very little input into the story. The GM knew where it was going and what was going to happen, but the game was a blast. And we were actually living inside a snail shell. And one of the PCs was actually going to birth the new world because this one was dying. And I know it sounds off the wall a bit, especially for Rollmaster, which is more hacky slashy. But you know what? It was a good story. And we just sat back and relaxed and realized that, we weren't going to impact the story, but we also weren't likely going to die because we were the audience for the story. So we had some fun with it.
Yeah, I think there's space for all kinds of games, and there's definitely times when a railroad can be, like you're saying, absolutely fun. It's all about, it's that kind of thing where if you all kind of know what you're getting into and know what it is, I think a lot of it's that communication, because if you don't know, or you have different ideas. I remember on some forum somewhere I was talking to somebody and they were just upset with their players and their campaign, and it turned out that he had told the players it was essentially a sandbox, and his players were doing goofy but kind of sandboxy things. But the reality was he wanted to do a very narrative, somewhat railroady thing, and they just weren't cooperating with him. But it came down to the fact that he had communicated to them that they're playing X kind of game, and he was trying to push them into a game type Y. So of course there was conflict there, but his concepts of those terms, he didn't quite understand them. And so once those kind of explained to him, it dawned on him that, like, oh yeah, maybe I didn't, we're trying to play different games. And I think that's often true with the kind of railroad sort of thing, is you're selling the game as being one thing, very open and very up to choices and things like that, but the game you're delivering is very linear. Whereas if it's linear and that's kind of part of it, then yeah, there's a whole kind of fun thing you can be had within that linear design. There's nothing inherently necessarily less fun with it, but I think it often gets caught up in that this is not what I was expecting, it's not what I was gearing up for, but I'm getting it anyway, kind of thing.
Yeah, agreed. And in this case, we honestly didn't know. We didn't know the GM when we joined the game. It truly boils down to, I don't get a ton of a chance to play, and I enjoy Rollmaster. So when it was we're going to play pure Rollmaster, and there's a GM in place, we just need a table of people, I rounded up a table of people for it. And really, it worked out great. Like I say, as long as you recognize what the GM is after, you can have a fun game either way.
Absolutely. So I haven't really read. I actually I bought a Rollmaster copy to read through it, but I have yet to do it yet. So what do you really like? What's the big things that you really like about Rollmaster?
The number one thing that I thought was astounding was when you call initiative, you can say you're going to do a quick, a normal, or deliberate action, and all of the quick actions go first, but they all have negatives. All the normal just act normally, and you go in initiative order, you still roll initiative and you go in initiative order, but by those ranks. So the first person to go in quick is going to be the first person to go in the round, whereas the first person to go in normal is going to be probably third or fourth in the round, depending on how big the combat is. And I really like that, because if you got something that you need to take your time, like doing a called shot, if you need to take your time and get it right, deliberate is going to give you bonuses, and other people can keep the bad guys busy while you set it up. And if you just have to do something to distract that wizard from casting that spell, then you can do quick and try to jump right in there. And I really liked it. Quick is going to give you negatives, but that's the price you pay for, just flying off on an angle. And I'd like to see more systems pick that up, because it really does work well.
Yeah, I want to say Shadow the Demon Lord has something similar. There's a quick act. I think they just limit what you can do if it's quick versus if it's slow. I think they just had quick and slow. It's really interesting. Have you ported that to have you used that in your CNC game or in your 5th edition game? Or is it something you just used in Rollmaster?
As much as I enjoyed it, no, I haven't ported it. It's an increase in complexity, and so some of the people who play with me regularly were in that game with me. Like, I really meant I rounded up a group of people to play. Some of them were people I knew that I could rely on, and some were new people. But they feared that it would increase the complexity unnecessarily, and I think there's some point to that, right? We play CNC for a reason. It's because there's one unified mechanic to do everything check-wise except for combat, and combat is simplified 1E. So adding complexity to that, probably not a great idea, but at some point I will throw it into one system, because I really did enjoy it.
Yeah, Mass and Danger clarified for me. Shadow the Demon Lord system is fast turn, and then just goes player first, then monster, and then slow turn, player versus monster. I think there were some. I think they had some give and takes between doing fast and slow. Maybe it was you could only do one thing in a fast turn, whereas in a slow turn you could do everything. Move, act, whatever. I think that's how it worked. So yeah, they was doing that. But the idea of having additional kind of bonuses or penalties, and I like having the third option of the fast, normal, slow. It sounds cool. I'll have to read through that in the book. But in Shadow the Demon Lord, I don't remember it slowing down the game much. So maybe they did a good job. You should check that out, just as far as maybe a simplified, kind of more OSR friendly version of that sort of rule. But it was kind of cool that you had this option of being able to try to time yourself a little bit, taking that chance. If I'm going, do I go quick and I'm more chance I'm going to go first, but then I'm limited versus, do I go slow? But then, the monsters may more than they're going quick, they're going to go before me, that sort of thing. Those kind of tactical decisions I think are great, particularly, as you said, if they don't do a ton to slow things down.
Yeah, and I have not looked at Shadow of the Demon Lord, so I'll add that to my reading list.
It's got some good
that somebody did it. The other thing I liked, 5th Ed addressed, which was Rollmaster would make a spell and it would get more powerful with your level. And they didn't always do that. They have like 1,500 healing spells that go up by each class, as where you have to take another spell. But quite often they did, this spell stays with you, it just itself gets more powerful. And I was glad to see 5th Ed pick some of that up. There are spells do more damage after a certain amount of time, or after a certain level, things like that. That I really think addresses what I like in Rollmaster really well without adding a ton of complexity.
Yeah, I still would like a non-spell slot kind of system. I've messed around with some of them, kind of in OSR terms. I keep thinking about if there's a way to do it with 5th edition without it being either too clunky or just making spellcasters just way OP. But part of me would love being able to do away with that. But yeah, I did like that. If you're above 5th level, or you can use a 5th level slot on a 3rd level spell, it becomes more powerful. You're just using at the higher level slot. I just wish there was a way to do some of that without getting rid of the slot stuff. But I haven't figured that out yet. But yeah, it's a cool system. I didn't realize that the Rollmaster had that. But yeah, I have enjoyed that in 5th edition. I think there's a lot of things they do well in 5th edition with giving you more kind of stuff as you level up. The one thing is find interesting, or maybe not interesting, but I wonder if they don't quite standardize everything as much as maybe they could. Like, there's superiority dice and there's like martial arts dice, but then it's spell slots and there's some other things. And I wonder if they were, who knows whatever their plans are for the future, but I wonder if there would be a way of, if you're going to make everything kind of level playing field, some way of managing all those, making a singular heroic resource that just does something for different classes, but you don't have to have a bunch of different mini mechanics for some of these different classes. Just put it all into one character mechanic that just gets utilized differently depending on what classes you are.
Yeah, my oldest son tried that. He wanted gunslingers and he wanted to standardize how all the magic systems and technology work. And he struggled, I want to say, 2 years with it, and ended up with, you can't do this cleanly. They're completely different perspectives on the same thing.
Yeah, my thing has been that I've done it in an OSR way is having you roll on kind of a spell casting chart, and the sort of like a roll 2d6. You could do it mathematically, or you could do a rolling on chart, but basically you would roll 2d6 and you would take essentially the difference between your level and the level of the spell you're trying to cast. If you worked, you were all good. And then I had a couple of different fail states. If you failed really badly, then you lost the spell and you would have to rememorize it. Otherwise, you could then keep casting, So I felt like, and I haven't done a ton of playtesting with it, so I don't know if it'll break under certain circumstances. The idea was to get rid of the kind of using spell slots and that sort of thing, and then you could just instead having a more or less a push your luck type system. If you were casting stuff within your means and you're doing so not in rapid fire succession, odds were very well in your favor that you could keep doing this indefinitely. But when you tried to push yourself, when you needed to cast more often than maybe you wanted to, when you were kind of backed up, then you could keep doing it, but then you would start taking penalties, you would start getting hurt, you would start losing spells. And once you lost spells, you couldn't get them back easily. It wasn't just, oh, I'll just sleep overnight and have them back again. It was like, no, now you're into like a week's worth of downtime to rememorize spells. So that you had this kind of, yeah, I can keep trying to do this, but if the dice go poorly, then I've just lost that spell for this adventure or for this, at least for, while we're in this dungeon for good. So that was what I tried to play with. And I've been thinking about if I could port that to 5th edition somehow, but I am way far away from figuring out a good way to do that.
Yeah, I played with spell systems on the very simplest of them, right? That each spell costs you a spell level or double its spell level and spell points, and then you get a pool and you just use them. That's too simplistic, I think. Unsurprisingly, a system we designed in the 90s, I actually think is the best. But, we wrote a game in the 90s that we called Bonds of Blood, and one of the things was it was a spell point system, but the more points you poured in, the longer it took to cast. And I don't know if you've ever looked at the newest version of Hackmaster, but it doesn't do rounds; it just counts segments forever.
I have not done that, but that sounds pretty interesting.
And we did the same thing. We counted segments, and so as you added spell points in, it took longer segments to cast spells. So the more power you wanted to pump into it, the more time people had to protect you while you were setting up. And like I say, unsurprisingly, since I was involved in the development of that system, I think it's a good one. But 5e doesn't really. I mean, there are alternate spell systems in 5e, but they don't feel like what I'm looking for. And C&C in the Castle Keeper's Guide has some suggestions, but not a lot of guidelines on how to do even spell points. I mean, for people who've never done it, they give an overview of what spell point systems are and how you could do it, but it's not a ton of information. So I'm sure there's a system in the plethora of systems we have available today that would suit what I'm looking for, but I'm not sure I have time to read all the systems out there. I mean, some of our players send me weird stuff like, you ever heard of Rayatana? It's a Japanese anime role-playing game that I think I might be one of the 10 people in the U.S. who bought it, but the player was just absolutely thrilled. It's more storytelling than role-playing. I read through it, and doesn't have the spell system I want, by the way. But I'm not sure I would find the one that suits my needs in the time I have available to read RPG stuff.
Yeah, the one I developed for myself didn't use spell points either. It was literally you just roll on the table. If you roll okay, you can keep going. If you roll poorly, you start to have issues. Let's see. Master Danger says, in Beyond the Wall, split into cantrip spells and ritual spells. You can cast your level's worth. Rituals could be cast any time. It takes 10 minutes per level. Minutes. Cantrips could be cast as many times, but you had a chance of burning out your ability to cast for the day. Yeah, the part that at the end was kind of similar to my system. That seems cool too. I just like the fact I wanted to get my goals. I wanted to get rid of slots, but I didn't want to replace slots with points. I wanted to kind of get rid of both of them. So I came up with this idea that as you basically would roll to cast the spell. If you rolled really well, the spell went off really well. If you rolled normally, then the spell went off normally. If you failed by a little bit, I had this kind of idea that you could keep trying to, like, you didn't lose concentration on the spell casting, but it's not going to fire that round. So you could either drop it, in which case there would be no penalty, but obviously you wasted your turn casting, or you could try to keep casting it for another turn and kind of push through. Or if you failed normally, the fail just fizzled, but then if you, in a sense, crit failed, then you lost the spell. And I think you could cast as many times in an hour without taking on penalties equal to your level. So if you were first level, if you stuck to casting one thing per 6 exploration turns 1 hour, you were fine. But if you had to cast more than that, you started to take on penalties, and then so on and so forth. Certainly not a perfect system. And then in the limited times I ran it, I think people liked it, because I think particularly coming from an OSR perspective, when your wizard was used to having one spell they could cast in a day, being able to even be limited to one spell in an hour is a great boon to them. But it came with those issues of, if you lost your one spell, if you just had one spell and you cast it and you crit fail and you lost that spell until you spend a week trying to sit down and rememorize it, then you were screwed. So I wanted to keep up that, not just a different way of tracking things, but have kind of give a different sort of tactical element to when you want to cast stuff, how you want to cast stuff. You could do stuff like spend extra rounds to cast stuff to make the roll easier. You could kind of try to mitigate things as best you could. But of course, in dungeons and in dangerous places, circumstances are often going to force you to make tougher choices than you want to make.
And I do like that idea. I mean, the idea that you could push yourself right on and on as long as you got good rolls is kind of there's a bit of a wildness to Magic there where you don't completely control the flow into you and you might burn yourself out, but for now you're actually cranking stuff out. I kind of like that.
Yeah, and it's a 2d6, so it has a little bit of a hump to it as far as the percentages, and it was measured so that if you were casting a spell that was your level, you were at that basically 50% chance that nothing bad side would happen, and if you were higher level and you were casting low level spells, it got less and less likely you would goof, but you always had that a rolling a 2 was always going to be horrible no matter what you were casting, and then rolling a 12 would be good. But the other thing is you could try to cast spells that were above your level. I think up to 4 or 5 levels above you, if you had the spell, you could memorize it and try to cast it, but you had a really high chance of really bad things happening to you if you cast it. But that option was there if you were just if you wanted to give it a try and you're first level and you wanted to try to cast Fireball, you could, but there are chances it's going to go really badly for you. But it gives you the opportunity to try it, and you never know, you might roll an 11 or 12 or whatever it would take, and then it might turn an encounter for you, or it could blow up in your face.
Mask and Danger said yours reminds him of Spellburn and DCC. I actually like DCC a lot, but Spellburn, you got your one character that survived the funnel, and they're hobbling along on their crutch, and then you Spellburn them out.
Yeah, that and I mean, I really like Spellburn a lot. I think that it just because I think in DCC, right, every spell has its own Spellburn table, and that's just a lot of upkeep if you're doing a lot of homebrew stuff, is having to come up with spell burns for any new spell you make. And then you have to, of course, if you're casting a spell, you have to try to find out. You have to always look up that spell just to get a hold of the spell burn. But yeah, it's a really cool concept. I always wish you could take that but make it a little bit less specific. Something that's nice about kind of the schools of Magic from D&D is you can always, it's evocation spell. Maybe you could have an evocation spell burn table to at least so that you could just do ones for each family of spells as opposed to having individual spells.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
All right, well, look at that. Somehow the two of us, we made it to the end. Any last things you want to pitch? You didn't throw any links in the chat before. You want to throw some links in now? Anything and any mentions you want to mention? So where can people find your Castles of Crusade OSR conversion doc?
HellebardeGames.com in the blog.
I was with Don from Hellebarde Games. Thanks for joining me for 2 hours of chatting here. I was Todd from Hex Press. You can Patreon/Hex Press. Obviously, if you want to support me, that's great there. But it also where I basically throw links to everything and throw everything out there. So it's a one-stop shop for finding all the various things that I'm working on. So you can find that stuff there. I will get this in podcast form the next few days. But thanks everybody for joining. Everybody enjoy the rest of your Sundays, and we'll talk to you later.